Twisted Metal 2 is of course the sequel to the original Twisted Metal game that launched with the PlayStation. While Twisted Metal 1 was pretty okay, there's little question that Twisted Metal 2 essentially one-upped the original in every single way when it was released a year later. Everything from the graphics to the gameplay was a massive improvement, and instantly became the car combat game that every other game in the genre would measure itself up to for years to come. So just what makes Twisted Metal 2 so damn awesome, and how does it hold up all these years later? Well, strap yourself in, kids, because we're about to blow this game wide open. Twisted Metal 2 is what you'd call a car combat game, or if you're super fancy, a vehicular combat game. So just what the hell is a car combat game? Well, basically it's a game where you choose your character and or car that looks like it came from a version of Mad Max that was made by a 12-year-old, and then get thrown into an arena to blow everything up that's coming at you. Explode everyone into a fiery inferno, and you get to move on to the next stage to do it all over again. Twisted Metal 2 is exactly that game, though it's a bit more in-depth than just ramming your car into other cars. I mean, you can totally do that if you want to, but it won't get you very far in the game at all. Each character and vehicle has its own statistics to take into account before you jump into the game. Some are super fast but have very little armor. Others are literal tanks that can take a ton of damage but move at a snail's pace. Each car also gets their own individual special weapon that does large chunks of damage when you can actually use them. So experimenting with each character is a must to find which one suits your playstyle best, especially with just how different each car and special weapon is. Once you select your favorite vehicle, you're thrown straight into the game with virtually nothing in the way of a tutorial, along with enemies that aren't going to ease you into things either. Seriously, these guys are out for blood the second you spawn, so you'll most likely be immediately bombarded with missiles and machine guns with no idea what's even going on. Basically, your goal is to take down every other car with the weapons you already have, plus the ones you'll be able to pick up around the map. Each car automatically starts off with a machine gun that's got unlimited ammo, and the aforementioned special weapon to use. Though the machine gun does almost no damage at all, and if you run out of your special weapon, well, you gotta wait for it to charge back up again to use. Every other weapon has to be picked up around the map, and you'll need every one that you can get your hands on. If you don't, you'll quickly find yourself out of anything useful, and that's when things can go really bad for you. The best way to play is to keep moving while exploring the track. This way you'll likely be coming across a constant supply of weapon pickups to use while your special weapon charges up. Speaking of those weapon pickups, you'll find a good variety to use on your opponents. From homing missiles to remote detonated bombs, there's a ton to use, and they're all fairly unique in how they fire, so you just can't blind fire everything you've got at the person in front of you. Missiles will of course behave like missiles, but some have to be shot with precise accuracy, while the others will generally home in on enemies. Besides missiles, you also get stuff like firebombs that shoot out in massive arcs. That can be kinda hard to aim at enemies, but does a ton of damage if you can manage to hit someone with them. You also get the aforementioned remote bombs that have to be placed and then exploded from a distance, and are great for setting up some multi-car traps. And that's just a few of the weapons you'll find lying around. It's an impressive lineup of stuff that constantly makes you change up your strategy depending on what you've got selected, which is way more fun than just unloading a bunch of weapons that all do the same thing, like so many other car combat games did. The strategy gets even deeper when you realize each car comes with their own set of fighting game-like moves that allows you to do everything from putting a shield around yourself to freezing other cars. Doing these types of moves will drain your special meter, however, so you have to know what to use and when to have the maximum advantage in every fight. There's nothing more fun than throwing out a perfectly timed freeze ball at your enemy, and then putting a remote bomb down next to him while you drive off, watching the explosion behind you. It goes a long way in letting you be creative in how you go about taking down each enemy. Basically, if you can dream up some wild plan of attack in your head, you can most likely do it in the game as well. And ultimately pulling it off is incredibly satisfying. Even though all of this would probably be pretty fun in a boring arena setting, Twisted Metal 2 goes the extra mile and throws in some incredible stages to fight in as well. Some are huge and sprawling, while others are more compact. They all usually have tons of different routes to take to run away from or find enemies, while some also feature unique obstacles, like falling off the top of skyscrapers to your death below. Each stage also comes with a ton of secrets to be found that lead to new areas or powerful weapon pickups. There's generally so much to drive around and explore in each stage that you could easily forget there are 5 or more other cars to destroy, if they weren't all constantly shooting missiles straight at your face. Mastering each level is imperative to having an advantage over the AI, since their ruthlessness is only outmatched by their cheap-ass tactics. You'll be getting sandwiched between cars regularly, while getting hit with missiles that seem to have been fired by a goddamn wizard. So getting a leg up on them by being able to memorize each level and using those secret areas is a must if you want to get very far in the game. Getting far in the game will also require you getting the hang of those car controls as well. While firing weapons is easy enough, actually controlling your car with a shred of accuracy is another story altogether. Calling Twisted Metal 2's controls loose would be the understatement of the year. These cars control like each stage is made out of ice, and then sprayed with a coating of WD-40. You'll probably spend the first 10 minutes of the game just trying to get your car to stay on the road, as it'll just be sliding and flying all over the place, especially if you pick one of those smaller, lighter vehicles. Thankfully though, you should start getting the hang of things shortly, pulling off some spectacular acrobatics while shooting missiles like a pro. While some people may think that the controls are a bit too wonky, I've always felt that they added a sense of speed and maneuverability to the game that was rarely topped in any other car combat game. So if you can stick with it, I guarantee it'll be hard to go back to the slower, more realistic controls of games released afterwards. Honestly, the best thing I can say about Twisted Metal 2 is just it's damn fun to play. It's not trying to be some realistic sim or anything, obviously. It just relishes in being a super silly video game, wanting you to pick one of these insane cars and lose your mind playing it without ever once questioning why none of it makes any sense at all. Hell, I wish more games were like that these days. Twisted Metal 2 is an absolute masterclass in car combat, and as far as I'm concerned was never surpassed. Sure, its sequels were fun, but none ever had the sheer fun factor that Twisted Metal 2 dished out every single second you played it. So if you ever get the chance to check out Twisted Metal 2, do yourself a favor and pick it up. It honestly hasn't aged well at all in a lot of ways, but it's still fun to play if you can just get the hang of those car controls. If you can, then you're in for hours of fun, and one of the wildest rides you'll ever have in any car combat game. Rock and Roll Racing rocked onto the Super NES in 1993 by a little-known developer called Silicon Synapse, though you may know them better these days as Blizzard Entertainment. Yes, the same guys that would later go on to rule modern-day society with a game where you can play as a kung fu panda once made a sci-fi racing game where you blow up aliens with crazy-ass vehicles while rocking out to an official soundtrack featuring the likes of Black Sabbath and Steppenwolf. No, I didn't just imagine all of that in some crazed fever dream state back in 1993. It actually happened, and it was called Rock and Roll Racing. So did Blizzard have the same kind of magic back then that it seems to have today? Or is Rock and Roll Racing a game that Blizzard would rather sweep under the rug out of sheer embarrassment after all these years? Well, put on your favorite 70s rock band tank top because we're about to rock out all over Rock and Roll Racing. Start up Rock and Roll Racing and you're treated to that awesome digitized soundtrack. Believe it or not, it was actually really neat to hear something like Peter Gunn coming out of your Super NES, even if it totally does sound like garbage listening to it now. After you're done headbanging to the title screen, you're tossed right into selecting your character. It doesn't really seem to matter which one you choose, so choose the one you think best represents just how radical the early 90s were. Selecting a car requires a bit more thought, as each one has different stats to take into account. Each planet will always also feature at least one car that costs way more money than what you have, but has way better stats than the other cars. So you can either save up to get the super cool car, or stick with the one that you can afford. You can even pick what color you want your vehicle to be, which was sadly yet another pretty cool feature back in 1993. Once you select your car, it's time to get your ass out onto the track and do some racing, and also some rocking, both preferably at the same time. Playing rock and roll racing is a pretty straightforward experience, especially if you've played games like RC Pro-Am before. Essentially, you get a 3/4 overhead perspective to view the action, and a few other cars to race and do battle with. It can be a bit disorienting at first due to just how fast corners can come up on you, but at least you get a mini-map in the corner of the screen to help you get a better idea of the track layout. Most of the cars in the game will be sliding through corners no matter how much grip they have, so you'll have to get used to drifting around corners early on if you don't want to be jamming head first into the side of the track. Racing is just half of what you'll be doing though, as you'll be using your weapons in rock and roll racing just as much. Each car starts off with a standard set of weapons, including a projectile that shoots out of the front of the car, a defensive weapon that fires out the back, and your trusty turbo boost to fling you forward uncontrollably. Initially, you'll only be able to use these once per lap, but you'll be able to buy more in the upgrade shop as you earn money. This is an absolute must, since your main strategy in winning most races won't be how well you stick to that sweet racing line. Instead, your best chance is to just blow the hell out of everyone in front of you, since the AI is incredibly aggressive. You also have various pickups on the track itself, like health and money, along with totally bogus stuff like mines and oil slicks. But if you can keep your wits about you and manage your weapons well enough, you shouldn't have too much trouble getting first in most races. After each race, you'll earn some money to spend on car upgrades that allow you to buff up everything from defense to cornering, and everything is worth considering. It's usually best to stick with weapon power-ups early on, and then start slowly building up speed and armor as you go along. As mentioned before, you can only fire your weapons once per lap until you start putting points into upgrading it, and you definitely need to be able to use your weapons more than once per lap to get anywhere. Thankfully, most upgrades aren't too expensive, so you should be able to power up a good chunk of your stuff within your first few races. You also earn points after each race, which is what you use to progress in the game. Earn enough points to make it to the next division, and you can choose to blast off to the next planet. Or you can just keep racing in your current division to keep upgrading your car to max level, or saving money for a better car. And trust me, if you're still rocking that old car by the time you get to the next planet, you'll be in for a world of hurt. So definitely take the time to upgrade to the better cars before you move on to the next planet. Rock and roll racing is definitely fun, but it's got some pretty rough edges to deal with as well, especially these days. While it was cool to see those big, well-animated cars taking up the screen back in the day, it just feels a little bit too close to the action playing it now. This can make the tracks later in the game incredibly confusing, since you'll have no clue which way to go if you're not paying attention to the minimap. And even if you are, it still isn't easy to figure out what's going on with some of them. The game seems like it would have been far more fun if the camera was zoomed out just a tad bit more. Combine that with this super aggressive AI, and those last few planets can turn into complete chaos in no time, with no way of winning a race beyond just blind luck. Also, that super cool soundtrack that you're rocking out to only has a total of 6 tracks to listen to, so it'll probably get old within the hour. Still though, if you can deal with those things, rock and roll racing is a pretty fun game to play. A lot of the problems that the game has is easily overlooked due to just how much fun it is whipping around corners and blowing up other cars all over the place. It's even more fun and chaotic when you bring out a second player for the 2-player split screen option. If you're interested at all in checking it out, you've actually got a few options this time. You can always play it by finding a used Super NES or Genesis cartridge somewhere, but in a really cool gesture to its past, Blizzard released Rock and Roll Racing along with Blackthorn and the Lost Vikings on BattleNet to play for free. Personally, I still think it's worth checking out, especially for free, even if a lot of what made it so cool back on the Super NES isn't impressive in the least now. And as far as I'm aware, there's still no racing game that rocked harder than Rock and Roll Racing. Vigilante 8 rolled off the production line and fell onto the original PlayStation back in 1998, and was the 635th car combat game released that year. Well, not really, but it totally felt like it at that point. By the time 1998 rolled around, the car combat genre was in full swing, and Vigilante 8 decided it wanted to get into the action as well. Developed by Luxoflux and published by Activision, Vigilante 8 needed to bring a hell of a lot more to the party than just shooting at other cars to get anyone's interest. So does Vigilante 8 push the genre forward at all, or does it just continue treading water along with a dozen or so other car combat games released that year? Well, squeeze into your favorite bell-bottom jeans, because we're about to get all weird and greasy with Vigilante 8. Right off the bat, you'll notice that Vigilante 8 tries to differentiate itself in the style department by basing its characters and cars and setting in the 70s, instead of the tried and true post-apocalyptic setting that so many other car combat games were using. Vigilante 8 goes out of its way to throw just about every bad 70s B-movie stereotype you can think of into the game, and most of it is laughably bad. Thankfully, the game isn't trying to take itself seriously in the least, so don't feel bad about laughing too hard at a character with a giant beehive haircut that's half woman, half robot, or a fat guy that rolls around in an old caravan truck that shoots bees at you. Yes, bees. At the very least, Vigilante 8 gets points for its crazy characters and unique setting. Sadly, things start getting a lot more familiar from here on out. While a cool setting and ridiculous characters will get your attention immediately, the rest of the game settles into the tried and true car combat formula as soon as you press the start button. While those cool 70s vehicles sure look neato, they all essentially conform to the same blueprint that Twisted Metal started years ago. Your smaller cars are of course faster, but take more damage. Bigger vehicles are slower, but you know what, seriously, if you watched the Twisted Metal 2 video, you'd know how this works. If not, then you should check that video out, because I'd literally just be repeating myself here. So instead of going over the basics of car combat games yet again, let's check out what Vigilante 8 does that actually sets itself apart from the crowd. Just like Twisted Metal, your car starts off with an unlimited machine gun to fire aimlessly with, but that's it. Everything else has to be picked up around the map. You get your standard assortment of missiles, mines, and other stuff to shoot people with, though you definitely don't get the selection of weapons here that you have in other car combat games. Vigilante 8 only offers up a total of 5 weapon pickups, so you'll find yourself picking up the same weapons over and over again throughout each match, and that gets really repetitive. Actually, you know what, that wouldn't be so bad if each weapon was cool and unique to use, but pretty much everything you pick up does the same thing. 3 of the 5 weapons just fire off in front of you, homing onto enemies without any effort from you other than just making sure an enemy's somewhere on the screen. This leads to confrontations that basically boil down to being battles of attrition, rather than the various strategies that you had to use when you're playing something like Twisted Metal 2 due to just how different each weapon was. At least one cool thing Vigilante 8 does though is that it actually shows your weapon pickups on your car. So if you pick up a missile launcher, it'll actually attach itself to the side of your vehicle. Kind of a neat little touch, and it actually helps to let you know which weapons you have available at a glance, instead of just endlessly cycling through weapon icons on some other part of the screen. Each car also comes with the ability to fire off a special weapon, but unlike other games, doesn't actually come equipped by default. Just like other weapon pickups in Vigilante 8, you'll need to actually find a box containing your special weapon before you can use it. It's a neat little idea that makes you compete with other cars for it, instead of knowing it'll be available if you can just avoid enemies long enough for it to recharge. One area where Vigilante 8 really tries to separate itself from the pack are its car physics. Unlike the super twitchy, fast handling of something like Twisted Metal, Vigilante 8 goes for more realistic car handling. You definitely can't whip your car around in Vigilante 8 like you can in most other car combat games. Here, each car feels fairly heavy, requiring more nuanced driving to line yourself up for shots, or even just driving around the maps. Each car even has its own suspension and weight, which also affects handling as well. That actually kind of sounds neat in theory, but in practice, Vigilante 8's handling feels too slow and unresponsive for the type of action that it's constantly throwing at you. It's not uncommon to spend most of your fights just trying to maneuver yourself into position, and then dumping everything you've got available at the other car before you're forced to slowly turn around and line yourself up all over again. It makes even the fastest cars feel slow and unresponsive at times, especially if you're getting slammed around by other cars. It's definitely a cool idea, but overall just kind of comes off more frustrating than fun most of the time. Beyond all that, Vigilante 8 has a pretty good selection of stages to wreak havoc in as well. Though most are relegated to desert or industrial type locations, they certainly do a great job of looking brown most of the time. Some stages do mix up the locations a bit here and there, even if they do feature an eye-watering amount of over-the-top lens flare that can actually make it hard to see sometimes. Seriously, look at this shit. What is even happening here? Nothing has ever looked like this. It's like someone jizzed all over the screen. At any rate, at least each stage feels unique, not to mention that just about everything you see is also fully destructible, so you can leave a pretty impressive path of destruction in your wake. You also get the standard assortment of stage secrets and hazards, making it decently fun to explore each stage as best you can to find some cool power-ups and stage interactions. Overall, I've got almost no complaints in the stage department, besides that awful lens flare, and they're actually probably my favorite thing about the entire game. When Vigilante 8 was originally released, it was met more with groans than honest excitement. By that time, everyone had kind of seen everything that car combat games had to offer, and Vigilante 8 didn't offer up enough to truly make it stand out, even if it did sell well enough to see a sequel come out a year later. Sadly, Vigilante 8 just never generated the excitement to push it beyond being yet another car combat game in an ocean of similar titles. While the setting and characters and car handling felt unique from other games in the genre, those things didn't actually make the game any more fun, and the handling actually hurt it more than it helped. Vigilante 8 isn't a terrible game by any means, it's just meh. There are way better car combat games to play, and nothing stands out enough for me to really recommend it to anyone checking it out now. But if you're not at all normal and are fiending for some sort of car combat action set in a 70s B-movie world, then by all means check Vigilante 8 out. It can be mindless fun for a bit, and it's at least as good or better than those other 635 car combat games released in 1998. Critical Depth submerged itself into your PlayStation disc drive back in 1997 and was the first vehicular combat game that developer SingleTrack made after handing the Twisted Metal franchise over to Sony first-party development. That's right, the guys that literally created the car combat genre are the guys behind Critical Depth. Even the back of the box seems proud of this by boldly stating it's from the developers who know vehicular combat. And, I mean, who could really argue with that, because these guys were essentially the OG pimps of car combat. So does Critical Depth carry on their legacy with another great game? Or does it implode under thousands of pounds of pressure to make a game that was just as good or better than Twisted Metal 2? Jumping into Critical Depth, you're treated to a brief cinematic that tries its best to create a story that justifies why everyone is fighting it out underwater in crazy tricked-out submarines. Of course, the answer is alien technology that's apparently been discovered by a submersible, and is then sought after by every explorer on Earth that's capable of getting their asses underwater. Honestly, it really doesn't make any difference at all, as I think by this point we've relegated car combat storylines to something like packing foam. It's just there to pad things out and hopefully doesn't get in the way of blowing shit up. Actually, I wouldn't even mention it, but you do get to see this scene at the end of the video that makes it entirely worth your time.
There.
Once you're done laughing at that guy's face being sucked off, it's time to get into the game proper, and there's no denying that Critical Depth is at the very least a unique entry into the vehicular combat scene. The game tosses the whole battling in cars and land right out the window, and goes for hot submarine on submarine action that takes place in the deep sea. That's right, every character you pick is piloting a sub, and is no longer bound by the boring physics of being on land. This definitely makes the game feel completely different from any other car combat game out there, as you now have the freedom of full 360-degree movement on every axis. Instead of just being able to attack opponents head-on, you now get the ability to come at anything and everyone at any angle. It was a totally fresh idea in a genre that was already getting old just a year in. Besides a completely unique setting and controls, the game isn't that much different from the rest of the car combat games out there. If you've watched the last few videos, then you already know how this works. Pick some insane character that's somehow allowed to pilot a submarine for some reason, and then do battle in an arena setting full of other people that want to kill you. You'll be picking up various weapons around the map to fire at your opponents, along with having your own unique super weapon that recharges over time. Yes, this is Car Combat 101, just under the sea. Critical Depth does try to mix things up a bit by tossing out the whole last man standing to win gameplay of other car combat games, and instead uses alien pods that have to be collected by the player before you can open up the exit to the stage. Each pod also gives you stuff like armor boosts or weapon power-ups when collected, so having 3 or more pods in your possession can make the person holding them almost unstoppable. Still though, it does at least make for some intense battles as you try to get to the pods first, or damage enemies enough to make them drop the pods they've already collected. It's a fun idea, but besides that, there's not much to separate Critical Depth from the rest of the pack in terms of gameplay. And if it also looks incredibly similar to the other Twisted Metal games despite the setting, then you'd be right. SingleTrack used the same 3D engine from Twisted Metal to power Critical Depth, which makes the game seem way more familiar than it should in terms of overly twitchy movement, crappy camera angles, and almost complete absence of actual physics that Twisted Metal 1 and 2 also had in abundance. And that brings with it the worst problem of Critical Depth. The combination of the underwater setting and the Twisted Metal engine just doesn't mix well. To be frank, the game just feels super janky. Everything from the movement of your sub to the combat feels just, well, off. The first big issue is the speed of the game. Due to being underwater, movement is slowed considerably from the twitch-based action of Twisted Metal. Hell, even Vigilante 8 feels faster paced than Critical Depth. And if you're saying, well, duh, it's set underwater, well, I get that. But this isn't a submarine sim, and it's just a bit too slow for something that's literally trying to sell itself as Twisted Metal underwater. Even the game itself seems to know it's too slow since there's actually a fast toggle in the options menu. But that just ends up making things feel even more awkward since the game was obviously never designed to be fast-paced in the first place. Where it was always super fun to power slide around levels in Twisted Metal, Critical Depth turns the act of getting around into a boring slog until you can finally find a group of enemies to shoot at. Sadly, things get even worse from there on out. Once you finally get into some action, you'll find that the combat feels just as weird as the movement does. Since the maps are so open, most of the ships will gather in one spot and duke it out in one huge clump of seizure-inducing chaos. Getting close will probably see your sub decimated in seconds, and since most stages have very little in the way of obstacles that you can use to escape or hide behind, you'll find yourself being hounded constantly. You do get a shield that you can use, but it rarely outlasts the barrage of crap that's continually coming from you if you get near enemy vessels. This turns most matches into a long-range affair, as you'll constantly be trying to hide until you can get enough weapons to unload into an enemy at a distance to do some massive chunk damage, and then swim away as fast as possible in the hope that someone else doesn't do the same to you. It makes each round feel like a cat-and-mouse scenario, striking when the time is right and then retreating instantly. And while that's fairly unique in the car combat universe, it's just not very fun if you're expecting the insane action of Twisted Metal. There's definitely a slower, more methodical pace to Critical Depth that would probably be more at home in a flight sim. And that may well appeal to some people, but for me personally, I'll take the faster pace of other car combat games over this any day. As already mentioned, the stages are one of the reasons Critical Depth falls flat. Not only do most of them look the exact same, since they're all just essentially different shades of blue, there's barely anything else in them that makes them stand out. Most are huge expanses of water with nothing in the way of landmarks or obstacles for long stretches. And the ones that do try to mix it up, like the stage set in the underwater caves, makes the act of finding enemies a huge chore. There are of course the standard assortment of stage secrets to find, but exploring never feels fun since your sub control's so awkward that you'll probably just avoid most of them. This seems like a missed opportunity for the game, since the setting could have made for some amazing stages. Instead, we're stuck with arenas that feel less exciting and imaginative than a fish tank at Walmart. I may seem really down on Critical Depth, but in all honesty, I really appreciate what SingleTrack was trying to do here, even if it didn't quite hit the mark. Instead of following up Twisted Metal with yet another cookie-cutter car combat experience, they took the genre in a whole new direction. Unfortunately, it just doesn't work out that well. While it's initially fun to be battling it out underneath the sea and refreshing to pilot your sub in any direction, it just isn't fun enough to keep you coming back. But if you find that other car combat games are a bit too fast and crazy for you, then you might actually really get into Critical Depth. It's definitely got its own unique thing going for it, and I know more than a few people that really enjoy it. It's definitely worth checking out, just being a weird curiosity in a genre that never tried too hard to shake things up at all. In the end, Critical Depth may have been a disappointment as the follow-up to Twisted Metal 2, but it's still worth trying out if you're a fan of the genre, or just want to see what Singletrack was doing after Twisted Metal and Jet Moto. So strap yourself into your favorite sub if you want something a little different. And who knows, Critical Depth may just pull you down to its depths and refuse to let you surface.